I've always had a fascination with certain works of classical literature, even in the most recent centuries, even the 19th century. But one work I find myself going back to all the time is a work by Charles Dickens called A Christmas Carol. And we're all probably fairly familiar with this story. It takes place at Christmas time, and it's about a people that are just simply going through the darkness and gloom of daily life, only to be interrupted by the joys and the joviality that Christmas brings to them, at least during this one part of the year. For everyone except this one person, and he's the main character of this entire tale, the Man of Ebenezer Scrooge. Because this is a man that couldn't be bothered with all of the triviality that he considers to be the season of Christmas. That all as he sees as important is money, and that even Christmas gets in the way of that. And so he's always a sort of bah humbug character. He always takes this sort of stance away from Christmas time. And so we see that he goes throughout life this way, that he's often consumed with this love of money. And then one Christmas happens where he's visited by three particular ghosts: the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas future. The ghost of Christmas past brings back both good and bad memories for Ebenezer Scrooge. He tells him about the good times, when he found out what work was, when he found joy in life, when he found things that were worth living for, even a love of his life. Though at one point in time, he starts to be consumed with something else, this love of money, and that starts to take place of everything else in his life, whether it's co-workers, whether it's that love of his life, or even friendships. He starts to move all of these things away to make way for one thing: being a miser, being in love with only money. And so this ghost of Christmas past walks him through this history, so much so that Ebenezer Scrooge is sorry for what he sees. And then he moves to the ghost of Christmas present that same evening. And here, this ghost is trying to point out all of the different joys, all of the different happenings of those around him, those that even wish that he was there in their midst. And yet he's simply sitting in the office alone and away from everyone else. And so this ghost is in particular highlighting that moment, that Christmas, and that celebration that everyone else is having except for him. And then we move to probably a more frightening ghost, the ghost of Christmas future, because here it shows the result of Ebenezer Scrooge's long life of simply caring about himself and caring about money. So we see that he goes and he enters into the grave. And yet no one really goes to mourn for him. And in fact, there's rejoicing and celebration because he's been such a harsh man. He's been so inhuman. He's never really looked out for anyone except himself. So much so that his grave is largely unvisited, and that there's only rejoicing when he passes away. So what does he do when he wakes up? Well, he takes that entire sort of dream sequence and he seeks to turn it around. He sees that he needs to make his life change, and change dramatically for the better, because he sees what's happening to him. He sees what's happened and what continues to corrode away his heart to make him more and more inhuman each and every day that goes by. And he starts immediately about that work of trying to reset what he's done and trying to make things better. And yet, as I read this story, I kind of wonder to myself, could we remove this element of Christmas and still have the same story? Could we maybe call it A Tale of Ebenezer Scrooge and simply have it about his conversion? That, he's visited by three different ghosts, and during the course of this, he decides to turn his life around. Or is there more to this Christmas element that makes this story make sense and actually work together for his betterment and even the betterment of each of us? Because we're in this midst of this Christmas celebration, and we see as we go throughout the readings and all of the celebration that takes place, we're centered around one thing: that Christ has become man, that he has taken on a human body, and that he has physically touched the earth, So much so that he has a love for all of us, that he's willing to come to earth to do some work to continue to save us from ourselves. And so we walk through these readings and they continue to celebrate that fact. So the first reading from the book of Isaiah, it celebrates this very fact that salvation is visiting man, that it's a beautiful sound, the one that brings the news of the tidings that Christ is coming. That even in the times before Christ, when he was prophesying to a particular people, that he's trying to relay to them this great message of joy, that Christ is coming, that he's going to touch the earth, he's going to make a profound difference, and he's going to open the gates of heaven yet again. Or if we look at this letter to the Hebrews, we see more of the same, that we're reminded of salvation history up to this point. And I want to embellish upon that just a little bit more, because we have to see where things went wrong so that Jesus came to make things right. Because we know all the way back to the story of Adam and Eve, whenever they made that fundamental choice against God, that they incurred this sin that each and every one of us have in our souls when we enter into this life, that when they made this choice, they closed the gates of paradise and they closed the gates of heaven. At least it seemed like it was going to be forever, until God sent his prophets to remind us that something else, something greater was at work. That all of these prophets, all of these men were continuing to bring about light. They were trying to shed that light even before Christ came, to show that there was hope, that there was someone coming to save us from ourselves. And so we move into the gospel, and here we're at the very beginning of the Gospel of John, and it celebrates the fact that God has always been in our midst, that he was the one that created heaven and earth. Yet there was something that even when things went wrong, that God was willing to walk amongst us. And so we see this important and this foundational moment, that the Word becomes flesh. The Word walks amongst us in human form. He takes on himself human nature to save human nature itself. That he's willing to take himself down from just simply being God, but he's willing to walk amongst us and to take on a humble form of even another human to do that work, to save us from our sins. And so that's where we get so much of this joy, so much of this celebration of the season of Christmas, because we see Christ coming incarnate. And it's a sign of hope, because the reality is, without Christ coming, we wouldn't have a future, or at least a good one. We wouldn't have that ability to look forward to the end of our lives and see that salvation waits, that eternal life waits for us if we are continuing to follow that throughout our entire lives. And so this Christmas moment is foundational, it's important, it gives us hope. It gives us that vision of a future that's not a bleak one. It's not simply a sort of dark and dusk alley, much like we see so many settings of A Christmas Carol. But it's actually something filled with light. And so we see the gospel, it uses this word light time and time again, because it wants to highlight that fact that Christ is coming to bring about that beautiful light that each of us, if we're giving ourselves over to that pursuit, can witness in the kingdom of heaven. And yet, if we look back at A Christmas Carol, there's something that we need to tie in here that makes it important. Because we know that if Jesus had simply come incarnate and that saved us, that we were immediately freed and we were immediately assured the kingdom of heaven, then that would be the end of the story. That there would be no further need of conversion on our hearts. That we could simply live as we wanted to. But if we look at the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, we know that that's not true. That we see Ebenezer Scrooge living about in this sort of inhuman way. That he's so corrupt, he's so evil that no one wants to be around him. And yet we know that there's so much more to life that we can't simply live that way. And the gospel reminds us of that we have a choice. It's not simply about living in this day of Christmas. It's not simply about living in the season, but it's making this Christmas choice. It's about taking this message, this incarnation, taking that hope and doing something with it. Because we can't simply live as Ebenezer Scrooge did, at least in his past life. We can't simply go about that. Because if that was true, Charles Dickens wouldn't have had a story. He wouldn't have had anything to write about. Because that ghost of Christmas future, he would have had nothing to say. And yet, if he's there warning him that he needs to seize on to that moment of Christmas, he needs to seize on to that moment of salvation, then there is a story. There is a need for conversion. There is a need that Christmas isn't just a day. It isn't just a season that lasts into January, but it's something more. It's something of a challenge for all of us. It's something that we have to embrace and sort of put into our hearts, that we have to be willing to frame it in our very selves and change the way that we operate even day to day, even whether it's in the midst of July or in the midst of December or even January. That we have to be willing to seize and see this message and to proclaim it with our very lives. Because this message of light, it's only important if we actually take on the warning, that message of salvation, that message of promise, that it does take work. It does take us changing our lives for the better. And that's why, in actuality, the element of Christmas is so foundational. It's so important for this story of A Christmas Carol. Because without it, we would have just had a story of a man who was simply inhuman, but there was no sort of end after that. There was no sort of reason to change. But we know that there is reason to change. There is reason to seek the better. There's reason to change our lives because Christ has become incarnate. He's come to give us hope. He's come to give us a future. But it's only if we're willing to change our lives and to conform to that. And maybe this year it's also been more of a challenge than we've expected. That in these past few months we've had a lot of struggles. We've had a lot of grief. We've had a lot of confusion in our lives. That we've had a lot of darkness to deal with. And maybe more than we would have expected or ever anticipated or dreamed of. And yet Christ's light seeks not only to puncture that light. It doesn't seek to simply puncture that darkness of sin, but it seeks to puncture the darkness that we live in even today. That as we walk throughout the world and we see darkness around us, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's grief, whether it's difficulties in our lives, that the light of Christ wants to become incarnate in those moments. It wants to be there. It wants to change things for the better, but only if we let it. Only if we let Christ's incarnation truly happen and capture our hearts, if we let him into our very being ourselves. And so that's the challenge, that as we celebrate this day of Christmas, this great season of joy, this moment where we recognize Christ is born in the manger, the newborn King is in our midst, that we have to continue to make room for him, that we have to continue to let our lives of faith capture that moment and carry it forward. And that's why that message of the Christmas Carol is so important, because it shows us what we can truly do with our lives if we capture that spirit of Christmas, that spirit of conversion, changing our hearts, and let ourselves be strengthened in faith. So that's the moment, that's the message of A Christmas Carol. That's a message of this Christmas day, that as we celebrate Christ becoming man and walking in our midst, giving us this hope, giving us a future in heaven, that we can continue to seek that even here on earth, that we can rest in that promise that if we seek Christ in our lives now, we can continue to see him in the kingdom of heaven, because that gate has been blown open by the hope that this Christmas season brings. So let's continue to encourage one another. Let's continue to extend this joy of the Christmas season to one another, that we need to continue to convert and to change our lives, to see this joy, to see this hope, to see the Christmas season, but to continue to proclaim this light to the world, that Christ is born, and that gives us hope of salvation.